Welcome one and all to Influence Music Podcast. We exploring new music and making connections back to previous musical generations via panel debates, conversations and interviews with artists, enthusiasts and media insiders. Welcome one and all to episode 16 of Influence Music Podcast. I'm your host Mark Williams, and for the first time I will be hosting the show on my own. So I hope you don't get too bored of my voice and you enjoy. If you listen to previous shows, you'll be familiar with the format. If not, we generally pick a pre-ordained subject. We will talk about that subject, and accompanying the show is a playlist available on Spotify and iTunes in a mixtape fashion, so you can listen to the music that we have discussed. So today's show is The House That Jack Built. House music, the history of house music, Chicago house, that house that came out in the early 80s through to the kind of the mid-late 80s. It's called Chicago house because most of the predominant artists were from Chicago. If you're familiar with the music, great. If not, but you are a house fan, and even if you aren't a house fan but you are a fan of electronic music, EDM, new wave hip hop, anything that has those kind of electro beats, then you can see the origins of that music in our house music. So I suppose the starting point will be how we got to house in the first place. There was an iconic moment in the history of house music that took place in 1979. It was called Disco Demolition Night. It took place in Chicago. There was a famous radio DJ who decided that he was going to hold an event. I think it was like at halftime at the end of a Major League Baseball game where he was going to blow up everybody's disco record. We'd obviously got to that point where disco had reached its peak. It became a bit of a joke. And I suppose at that point there was a social divide as well, because the representation of disco music is New York. And there's that kind of rivalry between Chicago and New York, and music had moved on, and disco wasn't seen as the music of the people anymore. So they blew it up with TNT, but there was a massive incident, there was a riot. I mean, the stadium was packed. I think the game was a doubleheader between the White Sox and the Detroit Tigers. So anyhow, at that point, this was the representation of the end of disco. So as much as disco was comical, it was also the prominent high energy music of the time. It was a club music. So what was going to be the replacement of that, and what were all those disco DJs and disco producers going to do? It was a time of transition. Those DJs, I suppose the prominent ones being Ron Hardy, Frankie Knuckles, they looked at a new wave of music, and this was the birthplace of Chicago house. So if you listen to Chicago house or this early house music, you can hear that the tempo is of that kind of high energy disco time. And the beat sounds are all quite similar to the sounds that we've spoke about in earlier episodes. If you go back to, I believe it was episode 3 where we discussed our favourite music producers. Mine was Jam and Lewis, and they developed that kind of R&B fusion 808 sound. Now the 808 comes from the fact that they used the Roland 808, which is a Japanese-based product. It was the same in house music. They were using those same drum machines, synthesizers, so the beat sounds are very similar. They're pulling on that same kind of disco energy, disco hi-hats, and a lot of those house track intros mimic the intros to those disco tracks. However, the music itself, especially the vocal house coming out at the time, was very one love. It was very conscious. Now, we have lots of conscious music now, but that representation kind of comes more from a roots reggae background if you look at that era of time. Obviously, we had the One Love movement in the 60s, but in terms of house music, it kind of feels like, let's all get together, let's dance, let's rave, let's show ourselves as a community. It's very, very much, for me, kind of a symbolism of the roots reggae. We've got loads of kind of soul and 70s R&B kind of vocals and vocal singers in there as well. The godfather of Chicago house, without a doubt, is Frankie Knuckles. On my playlist, there's more Frankie Knuckles tracks than any other, but we'll talk about those ones right at the very, very, very end. I suppose the first thing to talk about would be Trax record label, a Chicago-based independent that literally 75% of all great Chicago house tracks came through. It was a massive success through the era and to date. Anyone that listens to the music will refer to Trax as their starting point. I suppose there is conflicting accounts of the term or terminology of house music. I always think of it of being sort of 85, 86 when it sort of reached its pinnacle, but there was a build-up of music prior to that. I suppose the big names in the early days were Larry Sherman and Jesse Saunders. Those two guys were the two guys that co-founded Trax in the mid 80s, like 1983, 84, I think. And the label was designed basically to get that underground house music out into the public, out into the mainstream. And they got quite a few hits quite early on. All of the aforementioned Frankie Knuckles tracks pretty much came through Trax. Anything made by Mr. Fingers or Larry Heard came through Trax. You also had those kind of home productions from the youngsters in the game. Coming to mind, Adonis. I believe Adonis is No Way Back. He was 19 when he made it. Home production, sold 100,000 copies. So in modern terms, that's like 5 million streams. So very much an underground movement in those days, but Trax was able to bring the music to the forefront. And without a Trax, you don't get the next kind of, I would say, prominent house label associated with that kind of era and then into the 90s, which would be Strictly Rhythm. And now Strictly Rhythm is the label. I mean, Strictly Rhythm gave us Eric Murillo, Todd Terry, Louis Vega, Kenny Dope, Armand Van Helden, DJ Pierre, Roger Sanchez, Lady Fontana, Ultranate, Barbara Tucker, Real to Real. Like, so the evolution from Trax pretty much was Strictly Rhythm. So I suppose the first track on my playlist is a Jesse Saunders track, being one of the first tracks that came out on Trax. It was one of those tracks that paved the way for people like Frankie Knuckles. I believe it came out in 1984. The name of the song is On and On. It was a track that predominantly, like it did in that time, we hadn't hit the real musicality of house. So it was taking drum loops and beats from disco records and giving it that continuous loop with a Roland 808 beat. So it was machine wizardry, really. It was that ability to take that sound that everybody said was dead and buried and finished, and evolve it with the fact of sampling and looping into a new genre of music. Now, Chicago house as a whole, I would always say, dark, uplifting, rhythmic, almost trance-like, but you will find some uplifting tracks where you can think and say, oh, that reminds me of what we would now say is beach house, or that is what we would now say is tech or deep house or trance. And so depending on the track that I put in the playlist, you will hear elements of that which you will now hear in different types of house music. And these tracks are classics to the point that they're being covered by other mainstream pop and house artists to this day, 40 years on. 40 years on. So this wasn't a fad. It wasn't something, many a time that we have music genres that become really high profile. The one that comes to mind for me is dubstep. But then people are still out there still making dubstep music. Of course they are. But the profile of the genre kind of fades. And it goes through that natural progression and that natural cycle. We've seen it with jungle. We've seen it with garage. But with the origins of Chicago house having influenced all those music genres anyway, it always comes back. You'll always hear it. I mean, I was watching a video the other day of Kanye doing a music set, and he played 4 Chicago house tracks back to back. Now, I know he's a Chicago native, but especially with that album 808 and Heartbreaks, that's completely influenced by Chicago house music, without a doubt. If I said that the godfather of house for me was Frankie Knuckles, the close second without a doubt would be Larry Heard, aka Mr. Fingers. So I've got 2 Mr. Fingers tracks on my playlist. The first one's from 1986 is Can You Feel It? And without a doubt, this is the start of deep house. When you go to Ibiza now, they'll still drop this track. This is the birth of deep house, with the producer like Larry Heard, who pioneered that sound, which tempered many other tracks. It's kind of jazzy, it has soulful touches, but it's deep, it's solid, it's hard. The bass line is ridiculous. To some extent, that house music brings that kind of utopian feel, and nothing more so than Larry Heard's Can You Feel It? Which is strange because it's a long track. Again, house tracks, just like in the interview that I had with Benny V. Check that out, episode 12, where we talked about drum and bass. it wasn't strange to find a 7, 8, 9 minute house track. I mean, in fact, that was kind of the normality, and house EPs would have 2 tracks on the one A side and 2 tracks on the B side. Modern day now, when you listen to these streaming tracks, they're cut versions or cut edits because the files are too long. But I'm pretty sure that on the original EP, so on the original EP, there was 4 tracks. There was Can You Feel It? I believe Beyond the Clouds was on there as well, which is another Larry Heard track that I absolutely adore. Very different from Can You Feel It, but that is also on my playlist. Washing Machine, and I can't remember what the 4th one was, but I'm pretty sure there was 4. It was, again, another Tracks Out EP. It came out in 86, like I previously said. But with Beyond the Clouds, it's different to Can You Feel It? It's not as dark. There's more kind of melancholy strings. There's more musicality in it to some extent. There's a minimal kind of synth line running through the track. And the beat isn't as heavy. It's the barest of beats. There's space in there. So very different production, but both just as iconic. And then you kind of get into those tracks that were, let's get you sweaty, let's get you dancing, let's get you jacking up the place and sweating your nuts off. And for me, that is Marshall Jefferson's Move Your Body. Now, this is the rave track. This doesn't refer back to the other one I said was kind of minimalist house, and I said Can You Feel It kind of was deep house or tech. Marshall Jefferson's Move Your Body is house. That reminds me of the rave era, the early 90s, those warehouse dances and parties, which unfortunately I was too young to attend, but I love looking back at those videos and those flashbacks on YouTube. It has got great pianos running through it. It's an absolute blinder of a melody, and the vocals is just ridiculous. Like, it just gets you going. This is just the high energy track of this playlist. Talking about rave music, for us here in the UK, the Chicago house track that is the most influential music to our rave culture, to the 90s kind of ecstasy provoked rave culture, without a doubt, is Steve Hurley's Jack Your Body. It came out in 1987, so it's a bit later in the Chicago house era, which makes sense because it coincides with people saying this tune's a banger, evolving that, and then by the early 90s it becoming what we know as rave. It was just one of those tunes that came out, it's unapologetic, it's completely different from the house music we'd heard before. It was experimental, just like all the other tracks, centered around that Roland kind of sound, but it was a little bit more up tempo. It had more of a multi-instrumental feel to it, more of an orchestral feel to it. And it was also, I believe, the first house track to go #1 in the UK. Hence, then the evolution into the rave culture, because obviously with all music genres, there's only so far you can go without popularity. You know, you need people buying and listening to your records. So definitely in this country, in the UK, well, a big props goes out to Steve Hurley. And not only that, in the garage era, there was loads of tracks by Steve Hurley, remixed by Steve Hurley, that used to get incorporated into those garage sets, or Steve Hurley tracks that people would remix to make kind of UKG dubs of. You know how I feel about the garage scene. We can go back to our previous episode where we spoke about that. Without a doubt, Steve Hurley's a massive influence on my life and my music taste. We previously spoke about Adonis, No Way Back. Again, that came out in 87. He was only 19 when he made it. Like I said, it sold 100,000 copies, which is equivalent to like 5 million streams. But this is, I think by 87, house music has become a mainstay. People are into it. The raves are bubbling. And people then took the opportunity to make their own home productions. So by that point, it was in the mainstream. So those tracks that came out in 85, 86 were those introductions to house. By 87, 88, we're at the peak of house, where it's not just a Chicago thing anymore. It's not just those guys at tracks that are making these houses, becoming a worldwide phenomenon. We then get to Sleazy D's I've Lost Control. What can I say about this? I mean, It features kind of really dramatic vocals. They're really pitched down. It's almost villain from a movie like a Darth Vader voice or something like that. It's slow. It isoscellates round and round and round, so it's got that kind of rhythmic trance to it, more so than some of those other kind of up-tempo tracks like Move Your Body that I was speaking about before, that just want to get you on the dance floor. It's kind of dystopian and a little bit morbid in the way that it just kind of, it pulls you down rather than lifts you up. So it's a bit of a roller coaster of a track. Definitely one that's got to be in there, because it's, again, another evolution, another change in tempo, direction, production style. Iconic in itself, must be on the list. We then get into repetition, and the repetition of DJ Pierre's Box Energy. Now, this is one of those tracks that I was talking about, that the original vinyl just goes on forever. I think it's like 7 or 8 minutes long, and it's very unapologetic in the sense that it's just a loop. It's a constant loop of beats and synths, and there's no vocals in it at all, not even a vocal sample. So when you're talking about hardcore, or what they have in Holland called gabba, I don't know if you know that music, that kind of high energy music that's boom, 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 boom. This is the birthplace of that. This is the birthplace of something that just says, do you know what, this is hard on the ears, and this goes on, and it's energy, energy, energy. It's repetition. This was the first track for that. That's Box Energy by DJ Pierre. Just like that is really hard and kind of repetitive and ongoing. The flip side, something softer, something more conscious, something more beach housey, more kind of Cafe Mumbo-ish, would be Joe Smooth's Promised Land. Now, this has got those kind of utopian, conscious lyrics about how we're all going to find a place where there's nothing but love, and we all get on together, which is a social dream. But it's got a nice, soft, melodic beat to it. There's some beautiful keys in there. This is what I would say has evolved into what we now know as modern house music, because it has that electro beat, but the soft vocals, that kind of house music that comes through the mainstream. Joe Smooth's Promised Land is the starting block for that. We're then going to move on to Hercules' 7 Ways. Now, this is up there with one of my top house vocal tracks of all time. The beat's good, but this has got some fantastic vocals, so someone's really thought through the process here. We're getting into the late 80s now, so technology has moved on, and the development of production has moved on. So it stopped being how many drum loops could we get through this, and we're getting into house music and its musicality, where people are more familiar with production generally, with music generally, trained musicians rather than beat makers. So we go through a series of tracks then on the playlist. We've got Movement by Gemini, and we've got Servants Jazz House by Glenn Underground. Again, later tracks, we're talking 90s now. And right at the end, I put 4 Frankie Knuckles tracks. So there's no way that you don't know a sample that has been used from these tracks, or the vocals from these tracks, or the beat patterns from these tracks. So the first one's Frankie Knuckles' You've Got the Love, which is iconic in itself. The lyrics and vocals in it have been sampled, used many a time. I'm not going to go through all the versions of it, but I know that there'll be some really popular ones that you've heard of before. But I don't feel that you ever beat the original version. We have got Frankie Knuckles' Your Love. We've also got my favourite house tune of all house tunes ever, which is Frankie Knuckles' Tears, the classic vocal version. The breakdown at the end is unbelievable. The pain in the voice, the beat is just... The intro before the vocals come in gets you going, gets you dancing. And then the pain in his voice as he talks about his emotion, what a tune. Like, this is the pinnacle of all house tracks in my eyes. It's unbelievable. Then we move into the Let the Music Use You. Again, more of a rave-based track. And then I put at the end Frankie Knuckles' Baby Wants to Ride, because this is the track that effectively evolved into what we now know as French house. And those kind of house tracks where they use those orgasmic noises or sexual references, they slowed the pitch down a little bit. We wouldn't have the likes of Cassius or those kind of really famous Jean-Jacques Smoothie, any of that kind of stuff, if it wasn't for Frankie Knuckles' track Baby Wants to Ride. I mean, this is the starting point for that genre. So as we talk about house music and all the starting points I've mentioned in this show so far, we can literally do a timeline from whatever house music or electronic based music that you listen to now, tech, deep, soulful, if you're into trance, if you're into hardcore, French house, or a fusion of all of it, it all comes back, that takes that big circle, it will all come back to a Chicago house track that originated between 84 and I'd say 88. So this music is the origins of rave culture as well. It's the origins of the way that we behave on the night out and nightclubs and clubbing. Would we have those massive dance music festivals, especially in the UK, or Ultra in Miami? Would that exist without Chicago house? No. Would we have those kind of musically gifted crossover producers, very much like Kanye, who is a Chicago-based producer that would be massively influenced by the Chicago house music? K-Tronada, I Am Nobody, all those producers, all those beat makers, those electric hip-hop beats, the Evil Needles, the Comaneci's, the Mecha 83s. I know we talk a lot about the show, about the references to jazz, but Chicago house is just as much as an influence on those guys as jazz would have. I hope you've enjoyed the show and my little rant about Chicago house. I would love to do a more in-depth episode with anybody that is a Chicago house fan, or anyone that lived through that era that was a raver at those points. It'd be lovely to get you on the show and have a chat. Playlist is available on iTunes and Spotify. You can find the links on our Instagram. We always post it in the stories. Our Instagram is Influence Music Podcast. Our blog page is at influencepodcast.co.uk. You can look up news, reviews. All the episodes are pasted on there as well. So please do get in touch. We love your feedback, and we look forward to hearing from you. And we hope you've enjoyed the show and enjoyed the music that we've sent to you today. Influence Music Podcast, exploring new music and making connections back to previous musical generations via panel debates, conversations and interviews with artists, enthusiasts and media insiders.